Zhang Zha was strangely reborn in the crematorium furnace. Then he was chased by the workers in the crematorium overnight. Unexpectedly, just as he was despairingly accepting death, those workers suddenly went crazy. They seemed to lose control in an instant and started attacking their companions crazily. And the root cause of this mutation was actually from the blood Zhang Zha spat out. This was already the second time he had vomited blood, and every time he vomited blood, he saw many footprints walking out from his blood stains. He didn't understand what was going on, but because of this, he recovered some memories. He remembered himself before, what he had done after opening the blood coffin. However, just at this moment, the second group of pursuers arrived. Zhang Zha hadn't even reacted yet when someone pressed his head down. But at the last moment, he saw out of the corner of his eye the golden needle pointing at his temple. So he subconsciously raised his hand to block. And it was this block that startled the young man who was grabbing him. And Zhang Zha also took the opportunity to break free. This is a bit interesting. Looking at Zhang Zha's tenacious resistance, this young man in black suddenly became playful. While he was dodging and weaving in the forest, he was synchronizing information with his companions. He told them jokingly, saying that although he hadn't found the master in the coffin, he had found a fresher guy. All right, business is important. Thinking of this, the young man who was dodging suddenly turned around and directly struck Zhang Zha's chin with a palm. After that, Zhang Zha fainted. Later he had a dream. In the dream, it was still the blood coffin that lingered. But strangely, this time, he also vaguely heard the sound of a copper bell. Suddenly he woke up. Zhang Zha then realized that he was actually in a strange room full of jars, and the sound of the bell was still ringing in a disorderly manner. Only then did he realize that he was not only tied to a cross pillar, but also there was something like a magic circle under his feet. In an instant, Zhang Zha was terrified. Could it be that he had been taken as some kind of sacrifice? Just then, a slightly playful voice suddenly came from the side. Wow, it's really a miracle. I didn't expect you to really wake up. Hello there. Zhang Zha looked closely and then realized, not far in front of him, there were 4 people playing mahjong around the table. And the one who just greeted him was the young man in black who had captured him earlier. Zhang Zha was immediately shocked and sweating profusely. He wanted to shout something, but found that his mouth seemed to be stuffed with something. And there was also a metal curtain hanging on his face. Looking at Zhang Zha's struggling appearance, the young man in black suddenly took pity. He walked up to him and helped him a little. Without the obstruction, Zhang Zha suddenly started to vomit. But this time, he didn't cough up blood again, but instead vomited a pile of white granules. The young man in black told him that it was glutinous rice. It was used for detoxification. But Zhang Zha obviously wasn't in the mood to pay attention to this, but instead opened his mouth and shouted at them. He said that he hadn't done anything, hoping that the gentleman could be merciful. In the midst of his explanation, he suddenly saw the red characters painted all over his body. He was even more terrified in his heart and began to struggle desperately. Unexpectedly, the young man suddenly chuckled, saying that if the string tied to the bell was broken, then this big sister would bury you. Hearing this, Zhang Zha was shocked and also became obedient. Seeing that this kid was finally normal, the four people playing mahjong finally started talking about serious matters. They first asked Zhang Zha his name and why he appeared in that room last night. Zhang Zha naturally didn't hide anything about this and told them everything he had seen. At this time, the middle-aged uncle, who was facing away from him, suddenly asked, "Who else is in that house besides you?" Who else? Wasn't it just himself and those men in black? Thinking of this, Zhang Zha was suddenly shocked. He quickly defended himself, saying that he didn't kill those people. But as soon as he finished speaking, the cold-faced sister, who had been silent all along, suddenly glared at him with murderous intent. Zhang Zha was immediately so frightened that his hair stood on end. He quickly shifted his gaze and added, "I also found a coffin and a boy in the coffin." Hearing this, the few people fell silent, seeming to be thinking about something. Suddenly, another man pointed at him with a back scratcher shaped like a palm, asking him if he had secretly taken the coffin and the boy away and hidden them. How could that be possible? He was clearly killed by a group of men in black and then sent to the crematorium furnace. Listening to Zhang Zha's explanation, the few people didn't seem to doubt the truth, because that big sister had already conducted an investigation afterwards. She found that the men who were chasing Zhang Zha were all workers from the nearby funeral home. Moreover, these people also secretly take on some underworld jobs, such as helping people dispose of some corpses. Hearing this, the middle-aged man was a little puzzled. How could the underworld be involved in this kind of thing? Listening to their conversation, Zhang Zha then understood that the group of men in black he had encountered, who were impersonating police officers, were actually underworld members. But before he could even think carefully, that huge red back scratcher pointed at him again. It turned out that the man was asking him why he had offended the underworld. As soon as Zhang Zha heard this, he knew he had been misunderstood again. He quickly explained, "How could a delivery guy like me offend the underworld?" Hearing this, the young man in black suddenly frowned and said something. It seems that those underworld people don't know that this Zhang Zha is actually also the target they are looking for. Just saying that, could it be that the coffin and the boy were taken away by those underworld people, and Zhang Zha didn't know what the follow-up situation was? But judging from the current analysis, there is indeed such a possibility. But the middle-aged man shook his head. He held a golden needle and was puzzled, because if it was just simply taking the coffin and the boy away, they would definitely not take out this golden needle. Moreover, this kind of thing has been extinct for at least 300 or 400 years. So based on this point alone, we can analyze that the boy in the coffin has probably been sealed for no less than 300 years. As for why it was later dug out and sent to that haunted house, we don't know. After the few people's analysis, Zhang Zha was confused. He didn't know what these people were talking about at all. Just as Zhang Zha was in a daze, the man's voice startled him again. He saw the man pointing at him again with a back scratcher, asking if he had pulled out the gold needle. Zhang Zha was startled. Subconsciously, he repeatedly denied it. But as soon as he said this, he suddenly began to hesitate. Because in those fragments of memory he had previously recovered, he seemed to have really done something. He tried hard to recall, and the picture gradually became clearer. It seemed that at that time, he saw the boy with a golden needle in his head. And then somehow, he suddenly went and pulled out the golden needle as if possessed. Then he saw the boy suddenly open his eyes. After that, he was so scared that he fled the room. But now, even though Zhang Zha remembered these things, he still insisted that he didn't pull out the golden needle. Unexpectedly, the man didn't even think and said he was lying. Could it be that Zhang Zha's expression betrayed himself? But strangely, the man didn't pursue the matter. Instead, he looked at the people in front of him with a serious face and said that they must find the child in the coffin as soon as possible. Watching the few people suddenly leave him aside, Zhang Zha panicked. He hurriedly asked who these people were, why they had tied him up here. The young man in black grinned and said, "They are all experts. Goddamn experts. Who introduces themselves so casually? But when you are under someone's roof, you have to bow your head." Zhang Zha had no choice but to patiently resort to his signature move. He put on a pleading expression, hoping they would release him. Zhang Zha also guaranteed he would keep his mouth shut and never leak anything about today. Unexpectedly, the young man refused directly, without a second thought, and said Zhang Zha was a valuable living specimen they had finally found after much effort. Of course, that was secondary. More importantly, Zhang Zha himself was very dangerous. If released rashly, it would inevitably bring immeasurable disaster to the outside world. Hearing this, Zhang Zha was immediately dumbfounded. What disaster could a small-time delivery guy like me bring to the world? Could it be increasing the workload? Regarding this, he was very puzzled. But just then, that usually taciturn elder sister said it's because Zhang Zha will spit out things that don't belong to this world. Hearing this, Zhang Zha was suddenly startled. He immediately thought of the bloody footprints he had seen earlier.
见到张扎周边的影子，
The young man grinned and prepared to tell him about those things. But just then, a crow suddenly flew in. It landed near the middle-aged man, cawing incessantly. After a moment, the four people playing mahjong stood up in unison, because they had found the hiding place of the young man in the coffin. Next, it's time to bring that young man back. Seeing them preparing to leave just like that, Zhang Zha panicked immediately. He shouted at them, "Are you just leaving like this? What about me?" Hearing these words, the young man suddenly looked as if he had just realized something important, saying, "Oh, I almost forgot there's still someone tied up here." But before Zhang Zha could be happy, the young man suddenly said, "Gongling, bury him." Unbeknownst to them, just before this group of four discovered the young man's hiding place, another group had also found this target through some strange means. They had found this target, and this group was none other than the gang of underworld figures from before. This young man is said to be the embodiment of the gate of hell, and has been sealed for 300 to 400 years. But just yesterday, he was accidentally saved by Zhang Zha, and then escaped to a deserted park with few people. But he didn't know that at this very moment, his hiding place had been discovered by two groups simultaneously. Coincidentally, Zhang Zha, who saved this young man, had also fallen into a crisis. Originally, he only wanted to remind these heroes not to forget about him before they went out on business. But unexpectedly, the young man in black who had captured him grinned and signaled to the elder sister beside him to bury him. This made Zhang Zha extremely worried. Why did I have to be so talkative and call out to them? But once the words were out, Zhang Zha had no way back, and that elder sister named Gongling was already preparing to draw her sword. Helpless, Zhang Zha had no choice but to beg pitifully, saying, "As long as you don't kill me, I'll do anything." Unexpectedly, the young man suddenly smiled evilly and said, "Indeed, we weren't planning to kill you, just to bury you for a bit." These words left Zhang Zha completely confused. Bury me? Could it be the kind where you leave the head sticking out? But then Gongling's words shattered all his illusions, because their so-called burying meant burying the head too. Oh, crap. What kind of release is this? Seeing that Gongling's long sword was already half an inch out of its sheath, Zhang Zha was immediately scared speechless. Suddenly, he had an idea, so he opened his mouth and started making up stories. He said, "I've hidden that young man. Without me, no one will find him." These words indeed worked. The four of them turned their heads back and stared at him in unison, seemingly judging whether he was telling the truth, and also seeming ready to see how he would continue his fabrication. Then, the uncle with the back scratcher asked him nonchalantly, "Where exactly did you hide the person?" Seeing this, Zhang Zha quickly said, "To find that child, you have to take me with you, and I'll personally lead the way." Hearing this, the others clearly showed a hint of speechless expressions, and that elder sister Gongling was even more short-tempered, directly exposing Zhang Zha, saying he's talking nonsense. And then she immediately prepared to draw her sword and chop him down. "It's over! It's over!" Zhang Zha wanted to cry, but no tears came out. He was scared into a cold sweat. But what he didn't expect was that the young man in black suddenly pressed down on Gongling's sword handle, signaling her not to act yet. He said with a smile, "What if this guy is actually telling the truth?" Regarding this, Gongling tilted her head, looking a bit puzzled, but helplessly let him have his way. This overjoyed Zhang Zha, who had once again escaped death. He quickly said, "I never lie." But these words were said so lightly that no one took them to heart, and the young man even smilingly helped him untie the ropes. It seemed they were really planning to take him out with them. However, he reminded Zhang Zha, "After we find that kid, you still have to come back with us, okay? And don't run around after we go outside, okay?" Although these words sounded very gentle, even gentle enough to make him agree. And Zhang Zha also understood the underlying meaning of this guy's words. But he didn't take any of it to heart at all, because at this moment, his mind was full of thoughts on how to escape. Naturally, he wouldn't pay attention to these warnings. So no matter what kind of reminder it was, he happily agreed very readily. But even so, he was still shocked by the densely packed jars in the room. These jars aren't all filled with human heads, are they? But before he could figure it out, Gongling directly pressed down on his head and pushed him out. As soon as he stepped out the door, he realized that this was actually a deserted temple. Although the fresh outdoor air made Zhang Zha feel a long-lost freedom, he still couldn't help but ask everyone, "What exactly is this place?" The young man grinned upon hearing this and said, "This is Li Song Temple." Li Song Temple? Isn't this a for A-level tourist attraction? Why did these people bring me here? Just as he was pondering, the middle-aged uncle waved his hand, signaling everyone to prepare to set off. But just then, the uncle with the back scratcher suddenly yawned lazily and turned around to walk back inside. He said, "I'm going to catch up on some sleep." Regarding this, the young man was a bit speechless, but he was also used to it. He didn't say anything, just called Zhang Zha to come with him. Zhang Zha learned from their conversation that this cool young man was called Zhao Zha, and that middle-aged man didn't plan to go with them either, only warning Zhao Zha not to act rashly again. Zhang Zha subconsciously followed them forward, but the feeling of the steps hurting his bare feet suddenly reminded him that he was still naked. He quickly called out to everyone to stop, hoping they could give him a set of clothes. Hearing this, the three of them turned their heads back again in unison and looked over, seemingly looking him up and down with great interest. However, being in a Taoist temple, what clothes could they have to wear? Zhao Zha casually tossed him a set of coarse cloth Taoist robes to make do with, and even politely said sorry to him. But these things were no longer important to Zhang Zha, because at this moment, being outside the Taoist temple, he could be considered to have regained his freedom to some extent. So next, it was time to use his own cleverness and wisdom. Thinking of this, he chuckled a bit naively, but his smugness didn't last long. A cold shout abruptly pulled him back to reality. It turned out that this trip out actually required taking a car. The atmosphere in the car was peaceful and harmonious, as if the previous burial had never happened. Zhao Zha told him that after the car reached the foot of the mountain, Zhang Zha would be in charge of the route. Although Zhang Zha cheerfully agreed verbally, he was actually overjoyed inside. Driving, that would be even better when the time comes. He just needed to find the right moment, then push open the door and jump out of the car, running down the hillside all the way. Wouldn't he directly shake them off? Wonderful, wonderful, truly worthy of me. The more Zhang Zha thought about it, the more smug he became. He had already begun to survey the outside environment, preparing to find that opportune moment in his mind. But what he didn't expect was that Sister Gongling suddenly stepped on the gas pedal, and the whole car suddenly sped up. This sudden acceleration directly ruined Zhang Zha's escape plan on the spot. His heart was filled with curses. He had no choice but to hold on to the car to steady himself. But that fellow Zhao Zha had an intoxicated expression, as if he really enjoyed this car feeling. And so, Zhang Zha was tossed and turned all the way to the city, clutching his trembling hand. He pointed out the way uncomfortably, telling them to continue driving forward, although his first plan didn't work out. Now that they were in the city, the opportunity was even greater. For instance, if he were to pry open the car window and yell loudly towards a crowded area, and then just have a few burly men surround the car. In this way, wouldn't he be saved? Perfect. Truly worthy of me. But before he could be happy for long, a wave of nausea suddenly hit him. No way. Could it be that I'm car sick? Left with no choice, he had to quickly ask them to stop the car, and then ran to the side to vomit. Watching Zhang Zha's back, Gongling casually asked Zhao the, "Aren't you afraid he'll throw up those things?" Zhao Yi wasn't worried about this, because the glutinous rice previously stuffed into that guy's mouth. So much glutinous rice wasn't for nothing. What's more, aren't you here, eldest sister? What is there to be afraid of? Although Zhao the spoke casually, Gongling knew what he was thinking inside. Do you really expect Zhang Zha to return to being a normal person? Zhao the heard this and subconsciously nodded. The reason he firmly believed that Zhang Zha still had a chance of being saved was because yesterday, after fighting with Zhang Zha, he discovered a bizarre thing. That was, Zhang Zha's body had already mutated at that time. To avoid uncontrollable factors later, he had prepared to take Zhang Zha's head on the spot. But what he didn't expect was that after Zhang Zha fell to the ground, the symptoms of mutation unexpectedly subsided in an instant. This situation was truly rare. So afterwards, that's why he captured Zhang Zha alive, and then brought him back to Lisong Temple. Hearing this, Gongling frowned, because she knew what that mutated state represented. But she didn't understand why Zhao the still brought him out, especially knowing that this guy was lying. Zhao Yi sighed upon hearing this, because he couldn't know the consequences of doing so. In any case, let's just treat it as letting Zhang Zha come out again to see this world. After all, this is probably also his last time walking in the world. And at this moment, Zhang Zha didn't know that his little trick had long been seen through. He looked at the two unsuspecting people in the distance and had already made up his mind that he must seize this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity now. So, he did it right away. He took off running, but unexpectedly, as soon as he ran to the bus stop, he saw two pale white legs in front of him. He was too familiar with this thing. After he saw this thing appear, he froze on the spot. At this time, Zhao the rushed over, patted him on the shoulder, signaling him to go back to the car first. Before leaving, he also thoughtfully looked around in the direction of Zhang Zha's gaze. After returning to the car, Zhao the suddenly dropped his joking demeanor and instantly became serious. He said to Gongling, "We need to hurry." Gongling immediately understood and directly stepped on the accelerator. So the god car took off again like a rocket. Zhang Zha became uncomfortable again, because as the guide for this trip, he knew that such speed was completely unnecessary. But Zhao Yi's words made his heart sink, because he said that on the road ahead, Zhang Zha could have a good rest. As for the guiding, it would be left to the navigation. Saying this, he looked up at the sky. Zhang Zha was shocked. Although he couldn't see anything from inside the car, he heard a familiar crow-cawing sound. Not long after, the middle-aged man who was hosting crows at Lisong Temple called Zhao Zha, asking if they had found their target. And at this time, Zhao Zha and the others had just gotten out of the car. Unsurprisingly, Zhang Zha was once again shaken to the point of vomiting, and Zhao Zha once again returned to that cynical and playful appearance. He looked at the dilapidated park ahead and informed Uncle, saying that his group had safely arrived at their destination. At this moment, Zhang Zha, who had recovered a bit, finally had the chance to survey the situation before him. When he saw the word Southern Paradise, his heart suddenly jumped, because this place seemed somewhat familiar to him. Unbeknownst to him, just as Zhang Zha arrived, deep in the park, a bald-headed youth suddenly turned his head because of the appearance of Zhang Zha, a fellow kind. He keenly felt a trace of unease. Although this youth seemed harmless and had always wanted to escape the human world, but in reality, he was a door, a gate to the underworld connecting to realms. Just like Zhang Zha, he also often coughed up blood and would thereby recover some lost memories. But at this moment, he was hiding alone in this abandoned park, as if searching for something. Could it be that 300 years ago, this place was precisely where the youth fell into hardship? But at this very moment, the arrival of Zhang Zha, this fellow kind, made him feel a trace of unease. Actually, Zhao Zha and the others being able to find this place was also thanks to the flock of crows in the sky. And Zhang Zha also, when he saw the name of this park, suddenly felt a sense of déjà vu. But looking at this dilapidated and gloomy appearance, he couldn't recall at all where that sense of familiarity came from. Walking along, Zhang Zha suddenly felt something was wrong. This place was in the remote wilderness, rarely visited. Could it be that these two were planning to bury him right here? Thinking of this, Zhang Zha couldn't help but shiver. He hurriedly forced a smile and changed the subject, asking them why they were looking for that youth. Zhao Yi explained somewhat nonchalantly. He said with a smile, that youth is very dangerous. And Zhang Zha was also listening absent-mindedly, because he was surveying the surrounding environment, looking for an escape route for himself. But just then, the bloodstains on the ground caught Zhao Yi's attention. He smeared a little and sniffed it carefully, and knew that the youth had been here not long ago. In that case, that youth must have hidden himself. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so quiet here. But such a dilapidated park, what exactly would attract him here? Just as Zhao Zha was pondering, Zhang Zha on the side suddenly exclaimed in surprise. Because Zhang Zha, who was surveying the surrounding environment, turned his head, discovered several large pits on the ground in front of them. Outside those large pits were numerous footprints. Seeing Zhang Zha's panicked expression, Zhao Zha seemed to have seen, like a curious child, smiling and joking with him, saying, "These footprints are just like the ones you spit out." Zhang Zha was taken aback. He only then remembered, all along, he didn't know what these footprints actually were. Upon hearing this, Gong Ling and Zhao Zha were both stunned. Can't you see those things? That shouldn't be. Zhang Zha was also surprised, thinking, could it be that within these blood footprints, there's something I haven't noticed? But just as Zhao was about to explain, Gongling suddenly frowned and whispered to them that someone was coming. Shortly after, they heard the faint roar of engines. It turned out to be the group in black who had arrived. Following them was the gang leader. Earlier, it was he who used blood as a guide to discover the boy's hiding place. Now, with a blank face, he warned his subordinates. Don't come back if you can't find him. Of course. He also saw the conspicuous white van. Looks like some clueless guys got here first. The black-clad underlings were much more diligent now. As soon as they entered the park, they began searching everywhere. And under the command of their leader, they didn't even miss the smallest corners, because they knew that their boss was looking for a boy. However, although this leader seemed to be commanding and imposing, he was actually grumbling inwardly. He somewhat resented that the boss only told them half the story. If they had been told earlier that Ghost Gate Pass was a boy, they wouldn't have been put through such hell. The point is, if you're looking for a kid, just say you're looking for a kid. Why the hell give it a name like Ghost Gate Pass? Who are you trying to scare with all this spooky talk? But even though he was grumbling inside, he still obediently hid a jade Buddha under his shirt, hoping to be blessed by the Bodhisattva. But just then, something unexpected happened in the crowd. A black-clad underling with long hair suddenly heard a noise. But as soon as he turned his head, he froze on the spot. This change naturally attracted the attention of others. Could it be that the long-haired guy had found their target? Just as they were feeling strange, scarlet blood footprints suddenly appeared in the beam of light. Then, the long-haired man began to talk to himself, muttering about his grandson not coming to see him, and such. Is this for real? The underlings were dumbfounded. Why is this guy using a falsetto to imitate an old grandma? But the next scene made the underlings uneasy, because the long-haired man suddenly roared, facing upwards, not only revealing a pale face, but also saying, "Grandma is back!" The leader immediately became anxious, trembling as he asked him what was wrong. But before he finished asking, another underling also suddenly started convulsing. And this guy was even more outrageous. He twisted his body grotesquely and said he wanted blood for blood, because the village chief had poisoned a dozen pigs in his family. And after that, the village chief even stopped their car and beat their whole family to death on the way to the county town to file a complaint. What's going on? Why is everyone suddenly starting to tell stories? The underlings were all bewildered, and for a moment they even forgot about the search. And this scene was completely seen by Zhang Zha and the others. He looked down in shock and whispered, "What's wrong with these people?" Unexpectedly, Zhao Yi's focus didn't seem to be on this at all. He looked towards a dark corner and said softly, spitting out a lot, "Did you see that?" Of course, this wasn't directed at Zhang Zha, but rather to Gongling beside him. Actually, Gongling also saw it. In a dark corner not far from the group in black, there was a boy watching them in terror. Zhao adjusted his glasses and said, "Let's observe for a while longer." But as soon as he finished speaking, the group in black suddenly descended into chaos. They began attacking each other wildly, baring their teeth and claws. Zhang Zha was horrified at the sight. He didn't understand what was happening to these people. This scene even reminded him of the crematorium workers who had once chased him. Zhao was immediately puzzled. Can't you still see it? Zhang Zha was stunned by this. See what? Could it be that there's something else? Zhao was a bit helpless, reaching out and pointing into the distance, telling him to stare at the black-clad man's back. Zhang Zha looked in the direction he indicated, and indeed, he saw a black-clad man who looked relatively normal. And behind that black-clad man, 2 rows of blood footprints were quietly approaching. Zhang Zha gasped in shock at the sight, and Zhao quickly reminded him, there's more than just footprints there. There's something above the footprints, too. Zhang Zha widened his eyes and tried hard to see. At this moment, his pupils suddenly turned blue. He saw what was above the blood footprints. It was exactly the kind of pale, large foot he had seen before. Not only that, he also saw a complete dark shadow. After the shadow grabbed the black-clad man's head, a familiar transformation began. Zhang Zha turned pale with fright. He asked in a trembling voice, "What exactly is that dark shadow?" Zhao was uncharacteristically serious this time. He told Zhang Zha, "These footprints, or rather these dark shadows, are the things you spit out of your mouth." Zhang Zha's pupils shrank upon hearing this. He was suddenly shocked and bewildered. So that means, within the few mouthfuls of blood I spat out earlier, these monsters were hidden, and it was these monsters that were surrounding me and yelling open the door back then? Thinking of this, Zhang Zha quickly covered his mouth with his hand. He couldn't believe this, nor did he understand why this was happening. But Zhao explained calmly, these monsters are originally inside people's bodies. In fact, they are originally people. It's just that they are people who have died. People who have died, isn't that a ghost? Zhang Zha found it a bit unbelievable. Do things like this really exist in the world? Unexpectedly, Zhao suddenly gave a strange smile and made a shushing gesture, saying, "Never say the word ghost, otherwise they will hear you." And their name is Shang. Looking at a group of terrifying faces that suddenly appeared, Zhang Zha was scared out of his wits. But before he could react, he was grabbed by Zhao, and then they jumped off the rooftop together. Although Zhang Zha was almost dragged to the ground, he was not injured. Zhao was still calmly explaining to him, at the moment of a person's death, their consciousness will briefly leave their body. During this time, no one knows where this consciousness goes, but soon they will return. However, when they return, they need to pass through a door. And that door is you. In other words, since they are called Shang, then you are a Shang person. At this moment, the group of black-clad men downstairs had all transformed. Having heard the commotion, they swarmed towards Zhang Zha in a rush. Just as Zhang Zha was in despair, Gong Ling suddenly appeared in front of him. She held her long sword and said coldly, "I'll clear the way." And Zhao, this guy, was still explaining in a nonchalant tone. He said, "Since Shang and Shang people exist in this world, then naturally there are experts who specialize in dealing with these guys. So, you can call us CHU Wu. Until today, Zhang Zha realized that he, after rebirth, was no longer a normal human being, but a kind of monster called Shang person. As for the group of 4 who were ready to bury him at the drop of a hat, they were a special organization specifically to deal with Shang and Shang people, named CHU Wu. Right now, the little boy who's said to be sealed for over 300 years has already been captured by Zhang Zha. Barring any surprises, the mission is considered complete. The gang boss's men are clearly ineffective, nearly annihilated after Shang's attack. The leader, who barely escaped back, didn't even bother to pick up his sunglasses when they fell off, raced back to the park entrance. He needs to report what's happening inside to the boss, and then decide what to do. But the boss remained silent, stabbed him in the mouth with his folding fan, starting from his chin. He doesn't care about these lackeys' lives. He only cares if the job is done. Because he'd said, if you can't find him, then don't bother coming back. Meanwhile, back in the park, Zhang Zha and the others have finished cleaning up. As for this kid, he should go back where he came from. Zhao Zha gripped the boy's neck, showing no mercy. And the little boy hasn't said a word the whole time. Not sure if he can't speak, or if he's unable to. However, at this moment, the little boy suddenly remembered some distant memories. It must be from 300 years ago, when he was in front of his mother. Someone pierced his temple with a gold needle, and his mother was already weeping, her eyes filled with pain and helplessness. As he saw these memories, tears instantly welled up in his eyes. He couldn't help but roar. At that very moment, a strange, mutated power surged forth, along with the boy's face. All became terrifying in an instant. Zhao Zha reacted quickly, and immediately took out a gold needle. He stabbed it into the boy's original wound. This needle was like instant death, instantly suppressing the boy's mutation. His pupils constricted first, then quickly dilated, and his arms also dropped limply. Zhao Yi wasn't a cold-hearted person. He saw the tears welling up in the boy's eyes, and naturally guessed his past might be full of misfortune. But to this, Zhao Zha could only silently say sorry. He turned his head with a smile, ready to call Gongling and Zhang Zha to go back together. But when he turned back, he realized that kid Zhang Zha had actually disappeared. Gongling was also surprised to hear this. She didn't expect Zhang Zha, this guy, to dare to sneak away when she wasn't paying attention. However, before they could prepare to give chase, a dark figure suddenly appeared in front of them. It turned out to be the gang boss. He stepped on a lackey's head, saying Zhao Zha and them went too far, actually using such methods to hurt his brothers. Faced with such groundless accusations, Zhao Zha and Gongling were too lazy to explain a single word. They just gave him a look to let him figure it out himself. Unexpectedly, the gang boss suddenly pointed at the boy in Zhao Yi's arms, saying that was his private property. So, not only did you two massacre many of his brothers, but you also openly robbed his private property. It's really too much. So, for what you two have done, being sentenced to death, Shouldn't be too much, right? Speaking of which, he grinned sinisterly, revealing his black teeth. After a moment of silence, Zhao suddenly said, "Oh," as if he finally understood from the previous rambling the purpose of the person who came. He said with a smile, "You're their boss, right? You came at the right time. I also have some questions I want to ask you." After speaking, he casually discussed with Gong Ling, asking if she wanted to chase after Zhang Zha first. As soon as these words came out, the Gan boss became unhappy. He directly shoved his big face in front of the two of them and said gloomily, "None of you are going anywhere." In this way, it gave Zhang Zha this guy enough chance to escape. He ran out, panting, while looking back, afraid that Zhao and the others would chase after him. But strangely, up until now, it was quiet behind him. Looking at it this way, he could be considered to have successfully escaped, right? But thinking of those so-called Shang he had seen before, Zhang Zha felt a little frightened. But just then, Izai sound suddenly came. Zhang Zha was startled. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a pair of pale white feet standing not far away. However, when he turned his head to look closely, it was empty again. Could it just be an illusion? But strangely, the Zai sound was still constantly ringing in his ears. In shock, Zhang Zha had no choice but to run away. He was unwilling to accept the fact that he was Shang person by. He only knew that he was a living person, and also, he still had many things to accomplish. Soon after, he passed by that carousel again. Different from before, this time, he really recalled some distant memories. At that time, he seemed to be still a child, and this amusement park was still lively and bustling. In those memories, he also saw his dad and mom. Until this moment, he finally knew where that familiar feeling came from. And on the Gan boss's side, he had clearly underestimated Zhao Yi's strength. He hadn't even seen clearly what happened, and he was already kneeling on the ground, curled up, just wondering, did he understand some principles of being a person at this moment?